You say you still don't understand why there is a black white achievement gap in public schools in this country. You say you still don't get it. You don't understand why there is a discrepancy between how black students perform as compared to their white counterparts on national and state tests in reading and math. Let me help you understand. In 1739, an enslaved African from Angola named Jimmy led the Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina. The following year, in 1740, South Carolina passed what's called the Negro Act. And among the many things that they outlawed, they prohibited slave education in 1740. 1740. Now, this specific ban was on writing. Remember that I told you that there were some enslaved who were able to read just enough to be able to preach to other enslaved people using specific scriptures that talked about obeying one's master and accepting one's servitude. And we had those individuals on the plantation who helped to run the business so that they were able to know just a few words and a few numbers in order to help with the business. But the overwhelming majority of the enslaved people during that time were unable to be able to read and write. Now, later on, the law would change where it became an outlaw, or it was outlawed for reading and writing for enslaved people. But in 1740, South Carolina was the first state to prohibit slave education in 1740. Georgia followed them in 1759. They modeled their own ban on teaching slaves to write after South Carolina's earlier legislation. It was after the Nat Turner Revolt in Southampton County, Virginia, in 1831, where we see the most oppressive limits taking place on slave education and on the movement and assembly of black people. So, in 1831, Delaware passed a law that prevented the meeting of a dozen or more blacks at night, and in addition, black preachers were to petition a judge or justice of the peace before speaking before any assembly. In 1832, Virginia and Alabama prohibited whites from teaching blacks to read or write. If they chose to do so, they would be punished by fines and flogging. In 1833, again, Alabama enacted a law that fined anyone who undertook a slave's education between $250 and $550. That law also prohibited any assembly of black, slave, or free unless 5 slave owners were present or a black preacher had previously been licensed by an approved denomination in order to stand before them. In 1833, Georgia had a law that prohibited blacks from working in reading or writing jobs, and it prohibited the teaching of blacks, again, with a punishment by fines and whippings for anyone who chose to do so. In 1836, in North Carolina, public education of blacks was strictly prohibited, even though North Carolina had previously allowed free black children to attend schools alongside whites, but that changed in 1836. In 1841, in Mississippi, the state legislature passed a law that required all free blacks to leave the state so that they would not be able to educate or incite the slave population. And that same legislation required that any black preacher would have to be given permission to speak before appearing before a congregation. That was in 1841. In 1847, in Missouri, they prohibited the teaching of blacks, whether free or not, to read and write. And there are other anti-literacy laws that took place before that, such as in 1819 in Missouri, it was prohibited for blacks to assemble or the teaching of slaves to read or write. That was in 1819, and that law changed in 1847, as I just mentioned, to prohibit any teaching of blacks to read or write, whether free or not. Also in 1829 in Georgia, it was prohibited for the teaching of blacks to read, and again, it was a punishment by fine and imprisonment. So you can see over time, these laws came and they were rewritten or they were reestablished according to whatever was taking place at the time. Just think about what it must have been like, whether you were enslaved or free. You were trying to get an education in the South. It was almost impossible for you to do so without facing some type of penalty, whether you be the person who was trying to learn to read and write, or you be the person who was trying to help someone learn how to read and write. So if you still do not understand why there is an achievement gap, understanding that it's the history in this country of enslavement and then anti-literacy laws. And of course, I didn't go over all the laws. There are plenty more of them for you to go out and research so that you can see for yourself how these laws came and were rewritten, and more restrictions were added to it to try to completely control and subvert any potential rebellion or insurrection on the part of enslaved people, and to prevent them from acquiring the knowledge and the connection with anyone who was free to be able to collaborate on said insurrection and rebellion. We look at the events that took place after emancipation, where immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation, black codes were signed into law that were designed to continue to use black people as laborers by putting these ridiculous laws in place that said things like, if you know, if you aren't if you're found out and you're vagrant, then we can enslave you and put you, you know, to work for the public good. These were laws that were intended, again, not for the upliftment and the installation of black people as citizens in this country. It was intended to keep them as laborers so that the economy of the South could continue. We look at the Jim Crow laws that followed that, and we look at the separate and unequal education that many black people were experiencing in the South, and how that further contributed to the achievement gap that we see today when we have black students attending schools in dilapidated, unsafe buildings with old, outdated textbooks that were often the textbooks that were discarded by the white schools who had all of the things that they need, including the funding. When you look at all of these events and you move into the integration that took place in the 70s, after segregation was deemed illegal and unlawful, and you look at the integration period, even during the integration period is when you begin to see lots of black students being identified as special education students. You begin to see black students being identified as having learning disabilities after this period. And again, remember, now we're talking about moving black students who were in the South in classrooms with black teachers into classrooms now where they are with teachers who are white. They do not speak the same home language necessarily. They certainly don't share the same culture or understanding of one another. And then we begin to see, oh, this student has a disability, this student has a disability. So if you still do not understand how the achievement gap is related to these historical events that I have outlined, then I do not know what to tell you, except that you probably better go check out some history books, okay? The achievement gap is a direct result of legislation and procedures and practice in this country that was forced illiteracy of black people and the subjugation of those same people. Please like this video, share it so that other people can also understand why we have an achievement gap, and also make sure you subscribe so that you'll be able to keep up with what I'm doing on this channel, which is trying to bring information to light to help shape the future. And as always, peace to you and yours.